As you all know, within a generation of the First World War came a Second World War, and these things are related. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the interwar years, the 20 years between World War I and World War II, a time when the United States rose to prominence as the world's biggest economy, and then promptly had a stock market crash. Meanwhile, in Europe, Reconstruction was hampered by the rise of a new ideology and a new kind of politics, a dangerous one, called fascism in Italy. And fascism itself is brutal by definition, but an even more brutal variant of fascism arose in Germany after the war and took power in 1933 with a man named Adolf Hitler, and that variant is called Nazism. So in this lesson, it's really several lessons that I'm going to try to fit all in one video because they're so closely related. We're going to look at these interwar years, the 1920s and 1930s, the rise of fascism, and the Great Depression. Here's a snapshot of these interwar years. And the theme is that World War I created the conditions for everything that we're about to cover. Generally, in the 1920s, the United States was experiencing mass culture, flappers, prosperity, general good times, consumer goods that hadn't really been seen before, like refrigeration and a car, but also experiencing a lot of buying things on credit. And that's going to become important to the story starting around 1929. Europe was experiencing a very different decade. It was recovering from all of the destruction of the war, both in terms of the landscape and in terms of the people, the human beings. It was rebuilding. And to rebuild, it was borrowing a lot of money from the United States, which was at the time the world's biggest economy. Small conflicts were starting to pop up already in the 1920s. And here we start to see the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, remember, was that association created after World War I to diplomatically solve conflicts. And if you'll remember, the state that proposed it, the United States, the only state that left the war richer and stronger, did not join. As a result, the League of Nations couldn't really enforce any of its decisions. And keep that in mind because it's going to become important in the 1930s too. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, we had civil war turning into the consolidation of the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, with its Red Army. We had the very beginnings of nationalization of industry. And in the middle of the decade, Lenin dies, there's a power struggle, and Stalin takes over and begins his rapid industrialization 5-year plans. That decade ends in 1929, but with the stock market crash that dramatically changes things and sets the tone for the next 10 years. In the United States, you have economic depression and mass unemployment. In Europe, you have economic depression and mass unemployment that combines with a few trends that were already in the works. Fascism, an ideology that we're about to cover, rose in the 1920s. And really got a lot of steam from the Depression because there is a pretty strong connection between economic crisis and extremist politics. So you have the rise of fascism and the consolidation of fascism. Hitler takes power in 1933. And so Europe, things are looking very bleak. In the Soviet Union, meanwhile, the Soviet Union under Stalin is industrializing in record speed. And from the outside, things are looking pretty good. The problems the capitalist world is having with the Great Depression are not taking hold in the Soviet Union from the same way. So from the outside, communism looks like it's going to be a success story. Meanwhile, from the inside, you have the beginnings of the growth of a totalitarian state that uses secret police and forced labor camps, the gulags, and you had massive famines caused by the push to collectivize farming. So that's the general landscape. A timeline can kind of make this, these themes pop a little more. And it's not the worst idea in the world to get this in your notes. In blue, we have World War I starting and ending from 1914 to 1918. You'll see the Russian Revolution in the middle. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and it decided that Germany must pay reparations, have a limitation on its military size, would be broken up into smaller states that then become independent, and would remain separate from Austria. In the 1920s, the tone is set by the American economy booming, and Europe not so much, but it is recovering with loans from the United States. Midway through the decade, Stalin takes power, the USSR becomes totalitarian, and industrialization begins. And then the very next year, in Italy, a man named Mussolini becomes the dictator and turns Italy into a fascist totalitarian state. At the end of the decade, you have the stock market crash in the United States, and the effects of that are going to echo strongly throughout the world, with mass unemployment in the Great Depression. 3 years later, Hitler takes power in Germany, legally for what it's worth, and then invents a crisis to consolidate power and give himself full power. Nazi Germany becomes a fascist totalitarian state and begins the increasing persecution of minorities. And then this decade ends in 1939 with the opening salvo of World War II, when Nazi Germany invades Poland. It's good to have an overview of this time leading into World War II in your notes, just so you can kind of ground yourself in the story we're about to tell. The interwar period, first of all, refers to the time between the two world wars. And First World War really set the tone for the events that would follow. After World War I, Europe was transformed and disillusioned. World War I resulted in major political instability, causing many people to believe that radical change was needed to address the many problems of the post-war world. This gave rise to political extremism, on the left in the form of Soviet communism, and on the right in the forms of fascism and Nazism. Communism was triumphant in Russia, leading to the creation of the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union, which consolidated in the 1920s and became a rapidly industrializing totalitarian state under Stalin. The United States was an economic powerhouse until the stock market crash of 1929 triggered a global economic depression called the Great Depression, which highlighted the flaws of the capitalist world and prompted governments to take a more hands-on approach to state economies in both democracies and authoritarian states. Meanwhile, competing ideologies emerged in Italy and Germany, ideologies that competed with liberalism and communism and democracy, that is, as fascist states transformed themselves to deal with the challenges of a Great Depression and a post-war world. The 1930s ends with the launch of World War II, triggered by the aggression of fascist states, Italy, Germany, and Japan, and specifically when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939. So pause here and take notes either using the text or using this timeline, and then press play again so we can keep going. First, let's look at the rise of European fascism, a far-right ideology that took hold in the 1920s and seized power in the interwar years. Fascism is a difficult concept to understand because there's no one clear definition for it. It's the kind of idea that you need to make a list of characteristics so that you know it when you recognize it. It was caused by political conflict after World War I that democracies seemed unable to solve. Military and police forces that weren't in support of the governments they served under, economic crisis, and a general sense that perhaps Europe needed a new path. Perhaps the ideologies that led to World War I weren't sufficient for a post-war world. The context here is pretty important because without World War I and its effects on Europe, this may never have happened. World War I led to shock and disillusionment on a wide scale, with many people losing complete faith in the old systems, the old institutions, the old ways of doing things, while also being very afraid for the future, both because of the rise of the Soviet Union, but also because of economic crisis. Things were uncertain, and when people feel uncertain, sometimes they make really bad decisions. There was also economic trouble on top of it, sometimes caused by the destruction of the war, sometimes caused by inflation, and then compounded in 1929 with the Great Depression, which led to bankruptcies on nationwide scales, massive inflation, which is when money loses its value, and mass unemployment. And this is particularly dangerous because you have unemployment generally, but you also have a mass group of ex-soldiers who are unemployed and bitter. So people who know how to use weapons, are used to violence, already feel alienated from society, and don't have a way to reintegrate themselves into a normal functioning society at all. You also have political instability with different political parties competing for power. In Eastern Europe, you had new states form that were technically democracies, but without any democratic traditions. You didn't have really strong leadership emerge for these democracies. I think between the interwar years, France had something like 40 different heads of government. So like massive instability, even in democracies that were functional. And you had changing forms of government. Let's look at one of the key scholars on fascism describe it before I give you that list of characteristics. And as I'm going through this, one of the best ways to take notes on ideologies like this that are complicated is to draw pictures with like little speech bubbles. So Robert Paxton writes, at bottom, fascism is a passionate nationalism. Allied to it is a conspiratorial and Manichaean view of history as a battle between the good and evil camps, between the pure and the corrupt, in which one's own community or nation has been the victim. In this Darwinian narrative, so like survival of the fittest type of story, the chosen people have been weakened by political parties, social classes, unassimilable minorities, spoiled renters, and rationalist thinkers who lack the necessary sense of community. These mobilizing passions, mostly taken for granted and not always overtly argued as intellectual propositions, form the emotional lava that set fascism's foundations, a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions, the primacy of the group, toward which one has duties superior to every right, whether individual or universal, and the subordination of the individual to it. The belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external. Dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences. Here, alien means foreign. The need for closer integration of a pure community, by consent if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. The need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a national chief who alone is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. The superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason, or facts. The beauty of violence and the efficacy of will when they are devoted to the group's success. The right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law. Right being decided by the sole criterion of the group's prowess within a Darwinian struggle. Sound familiar? Here's what we need to get down in our notes for fascism in order to be able to recognize it when we see it. Fascism was established in Italy in the 1920s by Benito Mussolini. And this ideology gained popularity in Europe after World War I as a result of the instability caused by the war, the rise and perceived threat of communism, and economic instability. So those are the main causes: World War I, fear of communism, and economic crisis. Here's how World War I led to fascism. Fascists saw the mass mobilization in World War I, the violence, and the patriotic sacrifice that it involved, as an opportunity to forge a virile, purified national community. Also, the perception of having been treated as weak after the war led to fascism because it's very much a macho ideology of being the strongest and dominating others. And then third, this problem of ex-soldiers who had a hard time finding work after the war led many to be happy to serve as Mussolini's brown shirts, his like shock troops. And then later also Hitler had a similar kind of institution in the SS. And this was like a paramilitary force, a force of people who use like military grade violence and weapons, but aren't officially part of any state military. They just serve their leader. And in these groups, they found the respect and community and, frankly, the fear of others that perhaps they had been missing in regular society. The communism and Russian Revolution part of the story led to fascism by mostly scaring middle and upper class people to death that communist revolution could take place in their countries too. And they saw fascism as an ideology that was strong enough to stamp it out, to stop it from spreading, to stop like riots and, revolution from taking hold in their countries. Remember, at the time, communism looked like it was working under Stalin, especially after the Great Depression, when it looked like the Soviet Union was much less affected than all of the capitalist states. And so, Mussolini's fascists allied with local landowners and industrialists. So, in Marxist terms, the bourgeois, the capitalists, the owners of the means of production. So this is an ideology that got upper class support, while violently attacking socialists, communists, and labor unionists. Then finally, the economic crisis part of the story. Already in Europe after World War I, but especially after the Great Depression, made people more and more willing than usual to give up some rights to follow a strong leader who promised to lead the nation out of crisis. And this is a matter of willingness to abandon one's own rights because of a perceived emergency that you don't see any other sort of solution to. Final couple of notes just for clarity. Fascism is a nationalist ideology, believes that the national group is where people should get their identity. Communism is internationalist. It believes people all over the world are basically the same, and a working class person from Italy has more in common with a working class person from, the Soviet Union than an upper class person from Italy. So these are opposite ideologies that do not get along. Fascism specifically sees communism as a weak element in the state and also associates communism with Jewish people. That's going to become important when we look at Nazi Germany. In terms of fascism, like what the ideas mean, here I really do want you to create a bullet-pointed list because this cluster of features is really important. First and foremost, fascism is all about extreme, aggressive, violent nationalism. Not just, I'm proud to be American, but I'm American, I'm better than you. If you weaken the state, I'm going to kill you, and let's go conquer other people's stuff kind of nationalism. It involves gaining national strength through absolute, unwavering, unquestioned, disciplined unity. That is the goal. And here, if you look to the right of the slide, where my mouse is over here, you'll see the symbol of fascism that really, symbolizes this particular idea. Fascism comes from the word fasci. It's a bundle of sticks that if you bundle them together, they're really strong, whereas individually they might be easy to snap. This is the idea of fascism. Unity is what brings strength. And that unity is important to protect at all costs. Third, contempt for democracy and Enlightenment values. Fascists claimed that leftist politics, so liberalism and democracy and minorities, make a nation weak. And that leads to a huge reliance on authoritarian leaders. Fourth, the unity that fascists seek is achieved by identifying and targeting others, like groups of people to point out as enemies, who are then scapegoated or blamed for national problems and for making the nation weak. Fascism requires like a contrast, somebody to point to as both the source of any sort of national problem and a source of weakness that must be rooted out. And rooting out means like violently gotten rid of. Next, social Darwinism. Fascists see the world in terms of a survival of the fittest type of struggle between humans and between states, and in Nazi Germany also between races. So the fittest, the strongest survive. Fascism glorifies violence to suppress opposition. So it encourages violence as a way of dealing with political enemies. And here the unemployed ex-soldiers come in really handy as stormtroopers. Anyone who could get in the way of national unity must be gotten rid of and violently under fascist ideology. There's where it's like brutal and awful and dehumanizing and incredibly dangerous, because it's scarily successful in getting mass groups of people to increasingly accept this kind of behavior. Fascism involves a cult of a charismatic leader who embodies the state and demands blind loyalty. And fascism relies a lot on militarism. Fascist states are super aggressive because they feel entitled to everything. That's the nationalism on steroids part of the story. So they have super aggressive foreign policies. They think that war is good. It has like good, healthy effects on the people waging war, and the strongest side should win anyway. And indeed, the growing military aggression of fascist governments in Germany, Italy, and Japan would become the cause of World War II. Fascism also includes like what seems to me is like a really weird and kind of creepy obsession with manliness. There's like toxic masculinity is what we would call it now, but like embedded in the ideology, there's this idea that we were made to seem weak. We were victims once, and now we're going to be big and tough and strong. And with that comes like really patriarchal values, like only men are in charge. Women are relegated to really traditional roles. And yeah, it's weird. And there's also this obsession with restoring a mythic past, making Italy great again, like it was under Rome, if you will. There's an idea that like things were better before when we had strong leaders, traditional gender roles, and authoritarian government, like under ancient Rome. And we need to get back there if we're going to, do better. So that's fascism as it emerged in the 1920s. Italy became fascist first, and then Germany did too, under the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party really took a specifically racist and anti-Semitic emphasis with this ideology. So Germans, ethnic nationalists, white supremacists, if you will, really made fascism something even more horrible than it already was to begin with. Also part of fascism, not written on the slide, but it's important. In terms of the economy, everything serves the purpose of the state under fascist ideology, and that means the economy too. So whereas communism takes control of the economy to try to create more equality, at least in theory, fascist governments control the economy to promote like stronger and often more militaristic ends. So pause the video here, take really, really good notes, and then press play again so that we can keep going. So fascism, again, involves such a huge cluster of traits But again, like that cluster of traits is really important so that you can recognize it when you see it. And I can promise you, you will see it, tragically. It involves this mythic past idea. We descended from a glorious patriarchal past. They, whoever we're blaming for our problems, threaten that legacy. We, fascist, like nation, are rooted in the rural heartland, the countryside, the backbone of the nation. Our enemies, they, the people that weaken us, live in cities. Universities are often targeted by fascists, partly because they claim that they make people more liberal or Marxist or feminist, or they like impart Enlightenment ideologies. And a particularly fascist habit is to degrade the value of expertise. Specialization in any sort of subject matter is just sort of dismissed by fascist leaders in order to boost their own power. And this relates to another piece of the puzzle, unreality, fake news if you want to call it, or alternative facts, you can call it. Fascist leaders debase and degrade the truth. They debase facts. And without a common understanding of reality, reasoned debate becomes impossible, which makes it easier for people to be ruled over. I strongly recommend a book called How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. If this is at all interesting to you, I promise it's relevant. Anyway, let's look at this map. As you can see, Europe by the 1930s was increasingly overrun with dictatorships of extreme ideologies. You had communist ideology ruling in a totalitarian state over here in the Soviet Union. There's the specter of communism haunting Europe. Over here in these independent states that were created after World War I, by the 1930s, most of them were dictatorships. The first fascist state was over here in Italy, joined soon thereafter by Nazi Germany. And also Spain. We don't talk much about Spain, but during this time period, Spain was in a period of civil war between communists and fascists, and the fascists won. And then you have our two surviving democracies from World War I, England and France, who, like, if you look at it on the map, increasingly seem surrounded by authoritarian, scary regimes. Just to pause here and clarify a couple of things real quick. I want to touch on the difference between fascism and communism as ideas, because they're opposites, even though both shared the same form of government. They were both totalitarian, but other than that, they're completely opposite. Fascism is extremely nationalistic. Fascism is for the good of a particular country alone. It doesn't care about, people in different states. It cares about itself, and that's it. Communism is internationalistic. Communists believe that their system should spread throughout the world for the world's own benefit. Fascism does not seek a classless society. In fact, hierarchy is kind of the cornerstone of fascism, because in the survival of the fittest idea, it's right that the people at the top survive and prey on the people at the bottom. Communism does not like hierarchy. It seeks a classless society. Key supporters here are really, really important to the story too. Fascists are often aristocrats, so upper class people who own land, industrialists, war veterans, and the lower middle class, the people who had the most to lose should communism take hold in their country, the people with the money and the power. Communism was promoted primarily by the urban working lower classes, so people in the cities who were working class, and also the peasantry. The goal of fascism is to create the strongest, most powerful state that is unified, with like any sort of weak elements, minorities rooted out. The goal of communism is to create a communist state and then spread that revolution so that the working class of the world can unite and benefit. So, hope that helps. Next, let's look at the interwar economy and the Great Depression. And as we do this, think about what is it about economic depression that really fuels political extremism. There we have a colorized photograph from the Great Depression in the United States of people in line for food because they're unemployed in front of a poster from the 1920s that says the world's highest standard of living. I love that photograph. Let's reorient ourselves on the timeline. In the 1920s, we have a booming economy in the US, Europe recovering, so like not booming, but on the road to doing better, but starting to get some scary politics with the rise of fascism. Then after the stock market crash, we have the 1930s, which is dominated by the Great Depression, mass unemployment, fascism still in power in Italy, and then Nazi party politics taking hold. So that's fascist too, with Hitler taking power in 1933. And it ends with an example of fascist aggression when Nazi Germany invades Poland. These years can really be summarized wonderfully by these two photographs. In the 1920s, people in the United States were living large. They had exited World War I with more money. So prosperity was the name of the decade. By the 1930s, you had the opposite trend, economic collapse and the Great Depression. The Great Depression was complicated in its causes. Part of it stems from if you leave the free market completely unregulated, like completely pure market capitalism would want you to, actually some really bad things can happen, like the stock market can crash and then banks can fail, and then there are no protections for the unemployed. So one of the things that happened after the Great Depression was you'd get governments increasingly okay with intervening in the economy to make sure that people can at least survive. It was also caused by bad luck, bad weather in the Dust Bowl, protectionist tariffs, which tend not to be great for an economy, lots of complex causes. But really in this lesson, we're most interested in the effects. And those effects were massive unemployment and a steep drop in the gross domestic product, so in the economic power of affected nations. Here on the left, you'll see a graph of the unemployment rate. The stock market crash would have happened around here, and the unemployment rate like shoots up to just insane heights. Nowadays, I don't remember what number makes people nervous in the United States. I know that like if you get to 6 or 7% unemployment, politicians start getting nervous. And here you had 25% unemployment. That meant that 1 in 4 people didn't have any way of making a living. And when you have that on such a massive scale, that is problematic because people go hungry. Here you have a graph of the gross domestic product, so GDP. The Great Depression would have happened here. You'll see the economy of the United States tanks. This coincides with Herbert Hoover in office, who was a free market capitalist. He thought, the economy would just work itself out. Here, Franklin Roosevelt takes office, and he, as you'll learn in American history courses, did a lot of things, one of which was instituting the New Deal, by which the government takes a lead in creating jobs and creating protections. And as the government becomes more involved in fixing the economy, lo and behold, the economy does get better. And then here, you have the outbreak of World War II. The United States switches to a war economy, and that fixes the problem, but also lots of people died. The theme here is that the role of government expands as a result of this crisis. The Depression revealed the flaws of the free market system, and lots of different states, some democratic like the United States, and others radical like Nazi Germany, invoked government as a way to counter the issues of the Depression. In other words, the role of government had already been expanding under fascist and, the Soviet Union, those states. But even in democracies, government powers in the economy got bigger. And it caused people to doubt the absolute truth of a lot of things about capitalism that they'd taken for granted. The economic crisis it provoked also created the context in which extremist leaders claiming to be able to solve these problems were able to gain popularity. And the thing about it was that it didn't just affect the United States. Unemployment in 1933, so the year Hitler took power, 3 years into the Depression, worldwide, was shockingly high, 36.2% in Germany. Remember, like after 6%, normally people get nervous. 19% in the United States. In the United Kingdom, Britain. 37% in the United States. So huge numbers of unemployed, particularly in Germany. And because this is a worldwide problem, it is going to have worldwide effects. In Europe, the effects were growing acceptance of extremist politics. The countries that allowed the Depression to get the worst, or so it seemed, were the democratic ones. And maybe if you had a strong leader who could take decisive action to fix things, the economy would get better. If you're a rational person thinking about this from a very comfortable, safe place, you probably have your doubts. But if you are hungry, if you're worried about your children going hungry, if you don't know how the future is going to play out, maybe you take a chance and go for the big, scary, strong leader who promises to fix everything. Indeed, that's what happened, because look at this map. Fascist over here, fascist, fascist. And then all of these states in Eastern Europe increasingly became dictatorships, so that democracy was actually rare in Europe and kind of surrounded by these big, scary states with really aggressive ideologies. So now let's take notes on the Great Depression. First, the Roaring 20s, the decade of good economic times. In the 1920s, the USA experienced a lot of prosperity and also a lot of buying on credit, which led to the Depression. You can't spend money you don't have in mass without huge consequences, as it turns out. In Europe, peace was fragile and was preserved mainly because European nations were too exhausted to fight. Fascism was on the rise, fueled by anti-communism, and the League of Nations was largely ineffective, with few powers of enforcement because the United States, now the world's strongest and richest country, refused to join. Then in the 1930s, the Great Depression really shaped the next decade, in the United States, but also in the world. First, a good definition. The Great Depression was a global economic disaster that struck the industrialized nations around the world between the world wars, starting in the United States with the stock market crash of 1929. This led to mass unemployment and gigantic economic crises in the US and worldwide. Its global effects were mass unemployment and economic crisis. The United States had been the world's largest economy after World War I, and Europe's recovery from World War I depended heavily on loans from the United States. When the United States economy fails, it takes the global economy down with it. It can't give those loans out anymore. So suddenly there's no money coming in to help. And that causes a huge economic contraction in states that are busy with reconstruction, like Germany, like France. In terms of its effects on capitalism, they're just as important. While pure market capitalism involves zero government intervention in the economy, the Great Depression led governments to take on a larger role managing the economic crisis. It revealed the flaws of the free market system, and various countries, both democratic like the US and radical like Nazi Germany, attempted to invoke government as a way of countering the issues of the Depression. So, economic crisis gives more power to the government worldwide, basically. In terms of its effects on extremism and authoritarian governments, economic hardship causes desperation in a new kind of way, and it makes the population much more willing to listen to charismatic leaders who claim to have answers to all of their problems and believe that democracy may not be the best system because it basically failed during the Great Depression. The government was not able to protect its people from that economic crisis or to find a way out of it fast enough. And so you get the rise of politicians like Hitler who really capitalize on those fears. Economic crisis also created the context in which extremist leaders claiming to be able to solve these problems were able to gain popularity and used it as an opportunity to point out the flaws in democracy. Remember, this is a time when, from outside, the Soviet Union appears to be successfully industrializing and rebuilding, while the capitalist world fell apart. This lent some idea to the credibility of communism as an idea, and some Western powers in the grips of a Great Depression came to see communism as a real existential threat to their power and stability, and worried that people would start seeing it as a viable alternative to the capitalist system. So you get a reactionary fear of communism, and that contributes to the rising popularity of fascism. Like, it came to be seen as a choice between the two, and a lot of people chose fascism. States, especially the new democracies created after World War I in Eastern Europe, that failed to address the needs of their people during the Great Depression, were then weakened by extremist movements. So pause the slide here and take notes.